We have joining us right now Jim Robbins with the Washington Times, and by the way, he has his own show, The Conservative Connection, and I had the pleasure to speak with him this morning, and we're so happy to have you on right now. This is Brett Rappaport, the host, and John Rappaport, my co-host.
Welcome,
hey guys,
Jim.
how's it going?
Excellent.
Great. We've had quite an interesting conversation throughout the whole show today, but I want to get right into our topic today and what you've written about, and that is your editorial, The UN is Coming for Your Guns.
Right. Well, as you know, the United Nations this week is discussing a draft of the Arms Transfer Treaty, which is a treaty intended to regulate the international arms trade. And while some people say that has no bearing on domestic arms sales, many people are looking at it as kind of the thin end of the wedge for international controls or some kind of other oversight over domestic Second Amendment rights and gun ownership in this country.
Well, this is scary. This is just in a long list of treaties. We've been talking about all these different treaties day in and day out, whether they want to, the UN's supposed to regulate our children or how we breathe and what we eat and how much money we transfer from our pocketbooks to other nations. But when it comes to, I think our Bill of Rights is the most important part of our Constitution. As far as all the amendments go. And of course, the first 10 amendments make up the Bill of Rights. Our right to speech, our right to bear arms. When we started off as a nation, when we were sick and tired of the abuse from Great Britain, and we decided to declare our independence, it was the arms that we were able to get our hands on, that we were able to fight for our freedom and defend ourselves against what we considered at the time to be an oppressive, king. Now, today, we're willing to give away that Second Amendment right, or too many people are, to sign on to a treaty at the UN that puts us back into the very position before we were a nation. It's very scary.
It is scary. And, as I was talking about earlier today, there are good news and bad news with respect to this treaty. And the bad news is what people have been talking about for the last couple weeks, that even though the stated intent of this treaty is just to regulate international trade, as we've seen with the debate over Obamacare and other similar debates, once you start regulating something like interstate trade under the original intent of the founders, a very limited power, in the hands of the Congress over the years, it became an almost unlimited power. And now interstate commerce regulation is used to justify any kind of federal intervention in the economy. So if you have interstate, international commerce, that could be interpreted in the hands of activist jurists or federal regulators or others. Over time, they'll start to figure out ways to apply it to domestic gun trade. Like if you have a weapon that is manufactured partially with foreign components, for example, they could say, well, that falls under international trade because, your trigger was manufactured in Canada or something like that. So that's a very troubling aspect of this thing, and people have a right to be concerned about it. Not to mention the fact that there's this fad in jurisprudence these days amongst liberals to say we have to start reading international law and international customs into our own law and let that guide our interpretation of the Constitution. So if you add something like this to the mix, that's a direct threat to the Second Amendment.
Well, and not only giving up our sovereignty from a Bill of Rights perspective, but the fact that we would yield to international courts on more and more issues. Any domestic issue should never, under any circumstances, be yielding to international courts, and that's that's certainly the trajectory. That's the path we've been on. And so, gun control is certainly one of those things where it may not directly affect the the Second Amendment, but it will have, indirectly it will affect the Second Amendment, because what will happen is these arms manufacturers may be taken into international court and could be put out of business. You know, a company like Remington could be put out of business because of international lawsuits that could be brought to bear. And people like our president and his supporters know full well that when they yield this type of sovereignty, that it does have a net effect, a net negative effect, and their mindset is we will achieve our agenda by any means possible. You know, who cares if the Constitution, you know, comes in a Charmin package? And that's very sad. It's you know, and it's something we have to fight against.
That's right. It's funny to hear the proponents of this treaty saying that there's really nothing to worry about, or that people are blowing it out of proportion because it's a very limited treaty and that the language and the scope of it are very constrained, because they never apply that logic to the Constitution. The Constitution is always a living document. We can't be constrained by it. We'll read whatever we want to in it, you know, those kinds of arguments. So suddenly when it comes to this treaty or other similar agreements, they say, oh, well, this could never affect your Second Amendment rights. It could never affect the Constitution because it is so constrained. But in fact, if you look at the draft treaty language, and they finally came out with it, and now it's being debated, the thing is very vague and open to interpretation. And of course, you know, when something's open to interpretation, they're going to push it as far in the direction that they want to as they can.
Well, let me ask you something, Jim. I mean, I'm against any of these treaties with the UN because, frankly, I think the UN's an absolute failed project. And, you know, what's going to happen is the countries that have any kind of morality or any kind of controls will try their best to follow these treaties, but it's the countries that cause the problems in the first place that require the idea of such a treaty won't follow it anyway. In fact, I mean, how are we going to deal with it? Let me use an example. Right now, we're trying to deal with the uprising civil war that's occurring in Syria. And every time we go to vote on something, it's always China and Russia on the Security Council that will oppose the thoughts and feelings of the United States and Great Britain and France and Germany. Is the other member? You know, so what's going to stop when one of these dictator countries or, you know, thug-like countries, you know, ignores this treaty? We're just going to be back at the table and go through the same round of China and Russia opposing the United States because it's foreign policy. So I just don't understand the point of getting involved in this in the first place.
Oh, sure. In fact, the countries right now that are trying to get the human rights aspects taken out of it, which was the whole point of it, are countries like Syria, Cuba, North Korea, China. You know, the treaty would mainly affect the countries that engage in illicit, you know, legal arms transfers, like the United States and Britain, France, Germany, and even Russia. So, you know, the inequality of the thing is manifest. We're the ones who are mainly trading the arms. The states like the ones I mentioned are the ones misusing the arms. So why should the countries that are obeying most of the norms, you know, and other types of laws, why should we be punished for the misdeeds of other countries?
Yeah,
well, I'm sorry, John. You know, we know that there's over 70 million AK-47s floating around the world. I mean, clearly they did not come from the United States, so that's probably the preferred weapon of all the major conflicts around the world.
Oh, sure, and you know, they're the Russian models or the Chinese model or some other East European knockoff model. You know, they're out there. Somebody sold them. Someone made money off them, or maybe they were transferred covertly to, you know, by some back in the Soviet period to some client state to engage in something, or a guerrilla group, or who knows what. We are not the ones causing the problem. That's what I get back to. I mean, even though I say the United States is the world's largest arms dealer, yeah, but when you look at the most of the money involved in this, and the types of things we're trading, like high-performance aircraft or tanks or things like this, these are not the weapons that are being misused to commit the crimes that the people who are upset about these things are happening. What they want to control things like small arms and ammunition and stuff like that, which the United States also engages in a booming trade in. But again, we're not the ones who are mainly responsible for, you know, trading with the bad guy states. In most cases, we have sanctions with those states, and we couldn't trade with them if we wanted to.
I think it's also important to point out to our liberal friends who think inherently that the guns and military and these things are evil. It's just like criminals. You know, criminal states and rogue regimes use weapons to do horrible things, to perpetrate atrocities, usually on their own people or on their neighbors. And they fundamentally do not, no more than a criminal does, they do not pay attention to the laws anyway. So the laws are irrelevant. The people who will pay attention to the law in the first place are not the people that we have to worry about. In fact, those are the people who might very well need for a responsible country like the U.S. or Spain or somebody to sell them small arms because they may need to defend themselves.
That's right. In fact, an early draft of this treaty would effectively have made it illegal for the United States to engage in arms trade with Taiwan, who are one of our allies, and which really needs arms to defend themselves against mainland China. So the Chinese were very much in favor of that aspect of the treaty. Now that's been taken out, I understand. And as I was saying before, there is a good news aspect to this, and the good news is the new treaty draft has been watered down to the point where it really isn't doing the types of bad things that the earlier drafts would have done. And furthermore, there's very little chance that this thing would ever be ratified or passed through the U.S. Senate. So even if the UN comes up with something by Friday, given the current draft that they have that a lot of people are objecting to, even if they come up with something, the Senate probably wouldn't even pass it.
But of course,
that's good to hear.
It is good to hear, but of course, it's the responsibility of folks like yourself and your show and our show to make sure that we keep people aware of these issues. Because even if something isn't likely at this point to pass, what is important for people to realize is how many folks were willing to let it pass, were willing to give up U.S. sovereignty, were willing to use international bodies to achieve their domestic objectives. And worse than that, to trample states' rights, because many people aren't aware that the Senate actually has to ratify these treaties. And if the Senate ratifies these treaties, they, in many cases, or my understanding in most cases, would actually override state rights. Not necessarily step on our Constitution, but they will, but in part because they override state rights.
That's absolutely true. That's in Article 7 of the Constitution, that treaties are to be considered supreme law of the land. I have no doubt that the Obama administration would sign off on this thing because they're so desperate for any kind of foreign policy win. You know, they don't really have a lot to show for what they've done so far, other than killing bin Laden. And so they want to be able to say that they're actually doing something. So I have no doubt the White House will go along with it. The Senate would be where it's blocked. But ideally, it won't even get passed by the UN, that there'll be enough flack thrown up that they won't reach a consensus by Friday. Because if the UN does pass it and enough states agree to it, it'll always be out there. It could always be passed by a Senate. If not by this one, then by some future one. And so it'll be this continuing issue. Hopefully, it'll just get scuttled right now at the UN. If it does get through and the president agrees to it, and then it goes through a ratification process, it'll just be out there again and again, and that's something we don't want to have to deal with.
Well, the eternal pull of good versus evil, we just need to be forever vigilant, because disarming good will never defeat evil, and evil will never disarm itself. So I'll rest my case on that comment.
I just want to bring up, and Jim, I suspect we're going to discuss this for many weeks going forward regarding the UN. The biggest problem I have, not just with this treaty, but anything that the UN is working on, is it starts with this. One, the United States funds, just in the base budget, I believe it's something like 22%, if not a little bit higher. But then we also make other payments to the UN. So for the fact that we only get one vote, we're spending way too much money on this adventure, I'll call it. And additionally, it bothers me that when you look at all the committees throughout the UN, that often the worst offenders in particular categories are often on these committees. Sometimes they head up the committees. I mean, the UN has actually become, in my opinion, an absolute joke. And the reason, I'm bringing this up because the trouble I have with signing any of these treaties is because I have such disdain for the UN right now. I have no faith in their ability to do anything right anymore. I have no faith in them to actually do something towards the overall benefit of the world. That, I mean, frankly, if it were up to me, I'd like to pull out and start something that was just for the purpose of dispute resolutions, because I'm tired of seeing money being, for example, money being funneled into food programs that end up, feeding the abusive armies in countries in Africa while genocide's going on. Yet when we discuss the idea of genocide in the committees, it takes years to get anything done, and by the time that happens, you've already watched 1 million people be slaughtered. I mean, just things like that. I think the UN has absolutely lost sight of what its purpose is, and it's actually failing miserably.
Well, I would agree with that. The UN has definitely strayed far from what it was intended to do, and it was really founded in a different world. I mean, it was originally founded during World War II, when it was still back during the Age of Empires, really. It was never intended to have so many member states, and certainly not so many member states that aren't free countries. If we were going to found a new international organization, I would come up with some standards other than simple sovereignty, where a country like the United States is on the same moral plane as Zimbabwe. Yeah, right. have some kind of entry requirement that you have to be at a certain level of freedom, or political freedom or economic freedom, or both. Have something like that, a unity of free nations. And it would give an incentive to some of these rogue states and totalitarian, authoritarian states to get their act together and say, hey, if you free up a little bit, maybe you can join our club. But if you don't, then you don't.
I actually don't even mind if they're a member, but if you are part of the problem, you shouldn't have a voice and you shouldn't have a vote. You could sit there and listen and hopefully learn.
Yeah, well, that might improve it. I don't know. They don't seem to have learned much over the years. So,
I mean, we're dreaming right now, being that I think it's over 40% of the I forget what they call them, the 40% of the things that they vote on are always against Israel. I'm slipping my mind. It's just like half the time they spend is picking on Israel, and the other half is taking money from the United States to go fund their adventures. That's pretty much. I would say.
Yeah, they throw in a occasional support for feeding starving people and so forth. But as you pointed out, sadly, most of that ends up getting stolen, and the local warlords use that to create their own war chest.
Yeah, a few years ago, the UK did a study of their aid to Nigeria after Nigeria's independence over, say, a 35-year period to see what percentage of that aid money went to graft, what amount of it was embezzled. And the study came up with the conclusion that it was 100%. So 100% of British foreign aid to Nigeria was diverted to other purposes. So, go figure.
I mean, if you're in a clandestine operation and you're looking for a vehicle to fund projects, sure, it's a wonderful thing, I suppose. But it, for all the other intents and purposes, it's pretty much failed.
Well, if I were a third world dictator and wanted to fatten up my bank account a little more, then being part of the UN would be awesome. Just starve your people a little bit, beg for aid, and then divert it to Switzerland, and you're good.
And we've seen it even with the UN Secretary Generals of the past.
Well, just recently you saw the widow of Arafat coming out because and a similar guys. How is the man? Forget the fact that he was the godfather of terrorism, right? Think of how is this guy who's living in poverty. His wife is living in multi-million-dollar apartments and living a very lavish lifestyle in one of the most expensive cities in the world, Paris. There's no accident there.
Oh, sure. Plus, all these folks from developing world countries who are diplomats that get to come to New York and live there on stipends and have a pretty good life. So from the point of view of the rest of the world, I can see where the UN is a pretty good deal. But from the point of view of the U.S., I just don't get it.
No, and I'm tired of making bad deals.
Well, we're coming to the end of the show, so Brett, you want to give us a wrap-up?
Sure thing. Jim Robbins with the Washington Times and the Conservative Connection. I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the Final Say radio show. We look forward to speaking to you again, and I will try to tune into your show as often as possible.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much.